On June 28, 1914, Yugoslav nationalist Gavrilo Princip assassinated the heir to the throne of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Archduke Franz Ferdinand. Princip and his accomplices wanted to unite the Yugoslav people and liberate them from Austrian rule. The assassination set off a series of events that culminated in a declaration of war between Austria-Hungary and Serbia. Due to the European alliance system, all major European powers were drawn into the war, which spread around the globe and became the first world war in human history. This map below is a map of World War I combatants. So World War I was truly a worldwide war. Here, countries that were allied with the Triple Entente, known as the Allied Powers, are highlighted in green. Countries that were allied with the Central Powers are highlighted in orange. So essentially this war pitted two groups of allies against each other. The Triple Entente, composed of Russia, France, and the United Kingdom, against the Central Powers, Germany and Austria-Hungary. Though everyone believed the war would be quick and decisive, it instead bogged down in a prolonged war of attrition, with soldiers in the trenches fighting ferociously to move the battle lines by mere inches. So this poses the question, what does all of this have to do with the United States? Well, U.S. President Woodrow Wilson sought to maintain U.S. neutrality, but was ultimately unable to keep the United States out of the war, largely because of the escalating German aggression. On May 7, 1915, the Germans sunk the British ocean liner RMS Lusitania, which had over 100 Americans on board. Wilson warned that the United States would not permit unrestricted submarine warfare or any further violations of international law. In January of 1917, the Germans resumed submarine warfare. A few days after this announcement, the Wilson administration obtained a copy of the Zimmermann telegram, which stated that Mexico could join the war effort on the side of Germany, and then Germany pledged that in the event of a German victory of the war, the territories of Arizona, Texas, and New Mexico would be stripped from the United States of America and returned to Mexico. The publication of the Zimmermann telegram and the escalation of German submarine attacks on U.S. merchant vessels led to the U.S. Congress to declare war on Germany on April 6, 1917. More than 1.3 million men and 20,000 women enlisted in the armed forces. Though some Americans opposed U.S. entry into the war, many believed that they had a civic duty to support the war effort. U.S. government propaganda tried to mobilize the American citizenry through appeals to patriotism and civic duty, and by linking U.S. democracy with support for the democracies of Western Europe. So this is a propaganda poster for the American war effort in World War I in 1917. The poster portrays Germany as a mad guerrilla that would turn its sights on American shores if not defeated in Europe. While the U.S. was fighting this war overseas, there were also some really major effects on the home front. So this First World War had an enormous impact on U.S. politics, culture, and society. Advocates of female suffrage successfully linked the patriotic efforts of women in the war with voting rights. So this strategy that the women used was very effective, and in 1920, the U.S. Congress approved and ratified the 19th Amendment, which gave women the right to vote. Others were not so lucky, though. Hypervigilance on the home front led to outbreaks of violence against groups whose loyalty to the United States was considered a little bit suspicious. German Americans, labor activists, suffragists, immigrants, African Americans, and socialists were subjected to threats, harassment, imprisonment, and even physical violence. And at the same time, civil liberties were sharply curtailed. The Espionage Act of 1917 and the Sedition Act of 1918 criminalized the expression of anti-war sentiment and criticism of the U.S. government and armed forces. So after the World War was over, there were definitely consequences that came in the aftermath. The experience of the First World War was traumatizing. The so-called civilized Western democracies had gotten themselves into a ferocious and deadly conflict with uncertain origins and honestly an unsatisfying outcome. And although Wilson was the foremost advocate of the League of Nations, an international peacekeeping organization, the United States never officially joined the League due to isolationist opposition. When looking at the outcomes and actions of World War I, it is hard to determine whether or not the U.S. made the right decision when it decided to go to war. A historian at Georgetown University who argues that the U.S.'s entry into the war was a bad decision stated that the United States should only go to war when it's in our national interest, when we are really threatened, and when morally it could be defined as a just war. And I don't think any of those occurred in World War I. Detractors of the American entry into the World War I also argue that by tipping the scales to the Allies, the United States didn't hasten the end of the war, but actually prolonged it by removing the incentive for the British and French to make a negotiated peace with Germany as the battle stalemated in 1917. The ensuing punitive peace also laid the groundwork for an even deadlier World War a generation later and the rise of the Nazis. The decision to enter World War I led not only to the deaths of more than 116,000 Americans abroad, but to the trampling of civil liberties at home. The Espionage Act of 1917 and Sedition Act of 1918 curtailed speech. Vigilantes with the American Protective League physically assaulted anti-war activists, mail and newspapers were censored, and radicals such as Emma Goldman were deported. However, those in favor of the U.S.'s entry into the war said, given the U.S. policy and German actions, it's hard to see any president not doing what Wilson did at that point. A historian named Kennedy agreed, saying that Wilson has to follow through and go for the war declaration given the earlier policy. Wilson's whole credibility and the credibility of the country is on the line. Kennedy points out that by drawing red lines earlier in the war, Wilson had put himself in a sort of box where war was nearly unavoidable by April of 1917. Kennedy also says that most historians agree that American entry into World War I tipped the scales against Germany and that without the participation of the United States, allies would have lost, defined as having to make a compromise peace with the Germans largely on German terms. Things weren't going well for the Allies by the spring of 1917. They had suffered a big setback in Italy, the French army faced a serious mutiny problem, and Russia was teetering after the overthrow of the Tsar, which would lead to the eventual loss of the Eastern Front. Ultimately, the U.S.'s entry into the war was a good idea and led to a change in the economic balance of the world, leaving European countries deep in debt, but making the U.S. the leading industrial power and creditor in the world. Also, the U.S. changed the course of the war and ensured that the Allies would win the war in the end, making their entrance into the war very valuable.